This is Miss Wolf. I am going to read to you a story about the Great Plague Epidemic. At any time, please feel free to pause the video. This will allow you to answer questions or even ask your teacher a question, something you don't understand. Please remember I'm human, so as I read, I may make mistakes, just as we all do when we read. So please just excuse those and keep moving forward. So it's called London's Greatest, Deadliest Visitation. As I read, you'll notice I'm skipping all of these sections. If you want to pause your video, you're free to read those yourself, but I'm just going to stick to the story. So here we go. The Great Plague Epidemic of 1665. The rat looked dead. Good woman Phillips nudged it with her toe to be sure. It didn't move. She bent down, pinched its tail between her thumb and forefinger, and lifted the rat up so it dangled limply before her face. "Come into my kitchen and die on my clean floor, will ya?" she said menacingly to the little corpse. "We'll see about that." "You dirty beast." Good woman noticed with disgust that fleas were still jumping in the rat's coarse black fur. Clearly it hadn't been dead for long, probably killed by the cold. This winter had been the coldest anyone in London could remember, and more than rats were dying during the freezing nights. She opened the door and swung the rat by its tail, flinging it as far from the house as she could. It landed, with a thud, in the gutter. Good riddance to bad rubbish, thought Goodwoman Phillips, and she turned back inside, dusting her hands briskly on her skirts, ready to begin making breakfast. She thought no more about the rat that day or the next. She was a busy woman with a husband and sons to feed and clothe. And for a poor family like hers, living outside the walls of London in the rough and tumble parish of St. Giles in the Fields, food and clothes were often hard to come by. Worse than this winter's dreadful cold, they needed more fuel than usual for the fire. Good women feared that the extra expense would mean Christmas, just a few days away, would be a lean and dismal holiday for this year. Goodwoman Phillips was right to worry about Christmas. There would be no celebrating in her home. As the dark December day wore on, her head began aching, and her back and limbs pained so much that she could hardly stand. At first she tried to ignore it, but then fever and chills set in. By evening she was shaking so badly that she was forced to take to her bed. She lay in a daze, trying not to moan. Signs in the sky. Goodwoman Phillips didn't want to worry her husband and family, but they could plainly see how ill she was. Her sons sat by her bedside, trying to distract her with stories of the things they'd heard and seen in the city of London, where they picked up what work they could, fetching and caring for tradesmen. All of London, they told her, was buzzing with rumors and speculation about the meaning of the dreadful sign that had been spotted in the night sky. Since November, a comet had been seen flaring across the heavens every clear night. It foretold evil ahead, everyone agreed. But what could the awful event be? According to the latest rumors circulating through the city, the comet was a sign that England's king, Charles II, did not have God's favor. As a result, terrible punishment would be unleashed on the country. At this point, Goodwoman Phillips raised her head weakly from the pillow. "My mother always said the plague followed a coronation." Charles had been on the throne 4 years, and in that time England had had no plagues. Perhaps the sign in the sky foretold that God is sending the plague to visit the city again. Then, as a fresh wave of fever shook her, Goodwoman Phillips' thoughts drifted. She stared blankly out at the stars glinting through her window. Her sons crept away, leaving her to rest. Soon she was tossing in a restless, feverish sleep. House call. When Goodwoman Phillips woke, it was light in the room, and there was a visitor, a tall man in a long coat, unpacking a leather satchel and laying out items along the wooden bench. Under the window, a cup, a cloth, a knife. In a rush, Goodwoman Phillips' dazed senses sharpened, and she guessed who this man was and why he was here. "I'll not be bled," she tried for a firm, clear tone, but even to her own ears her voice was low and faltering. The doctor turned and looked at her calmly. "Goody Phillips, your husband and sons have consulted me about your case. You have had fever now for several days. In such an instance, the recommended course of action is bleeding, to balance the humors within your body. I assure you it's for your best." As the doctor spoke, he drew near. Goodwoman Phillips could see the knife glinting in his hand. Then it was done. A smooth, quick cut on her arm, blood dripping into the cup he held up. Her head thudded, and the room seemed to lift and tilt, then spin. Dizzy, she moaned and closed her eyes. "Fainted," said the doctor, "not uncommon for one so far gone with fever. But we can but hope this bloodletting was done in time." But Goodwoman Phillips didn't wake again. By midday on Christmas Eve of 1664, she was dead. God have mercy on us. A neighbor woman came that afternoon to wash the body and prepare it for burial. Although how exactly the body was to be buried, with the ground frozen hard, was a challenge the Phillips family had not yet considered. As it turned out, it was a problem they wouldn't have to solve. When the neighbor removed Goodwoman Phillips' nightdress, she gasped. A large red ring had appeared on the dead woman's chest and back. Under her right arm was an ominous purple swelling. "Abubo, plague tokens," whimpered the shaken woman. "Plain as my head, these are the signs. This is a plague house. Oh, God, have mercy on us." She turned and fled from the house, racing to the parish office to raise the alarm. Before long, there was a knocking at the door of the Phillipses' tiny house. The searcher had arrived. It was the searcher's duty to visit every house where a death had occurred in St. Giles in the Fields, to examine the deceased and to report back to the parish clerk, who recorded the cause of death in the parish register. All 119 London parishes kept registers of births and deaths, bulky volumes filled with line after line describing deaths from old age, from accidents, from illness of every kind. Yet of all the ways to die in 1664, none was more feared than plague, for plague was unstoppable. It could spread through a neighborhood like fire. In a matter of weeks, plague could engulf a whole city, even a whole country. The searcher for St. Giles in the Fields that day was a shrunken, wrinkled woman. She was desperately poor and spent every cent she had on ale at the inn. It was well known that she'd gladly take a coin or two should a family wish to have the cause of death changed in the report she delivered to the parish clerk. For a small tip, a suicide could become an accident. Even plague could be registered as a simple fever, but the Phillipses' family had no money to offer her. The sons had spent everything they had to bring the doctor in to bleed their mother. The searcher peered down drunkenly at Goodwoman Phillips, then reeled away in alarm as she recognized the plague tokens. She staggered out of the house, muttering to herself, only to return soon afterwards, bringing with her men from the parish office. Hurriedly they removed Goodwoman Phillips's body. Then they began boarding up the doors and windows of the house, sealing the dead woman's husband and son inside. Not until the parish was certain the house was free of plague would anyone be allowed to leave. Inside the darkened house, Goodman Phillips and his sons listened as nail after nail was pounded into the boards, blocking the windows. Finally, the pounding was replaced by a softer sound of brushes, and they knew that one of the men was painting a huge red cross on the door and the words, "God have mercy upon us," which announced to everyone in the neighborhood that this house was cursed with plague. That Christmas Eve, all was silent in the Phillips house. Goodwoman's husband and her sons knew that now they could only wait and wonder which of them would be next. Outside, the neighbors crossed the street to avoid walking past the boarded-up house, fearing that if they came too close, they would be contaminated with plague seeds. Overhead, the omen in the heavens appeared again, and the fiery comet streaking across the black night sky. What did it mean? What new dreadful events could be coming? The fear builds. A little more than a week later, soon after New Year's, John Grant stepped to the door of his London shop and tossed a coin to one of the ragged boys shivering in the frosty January air. "Run to the coffee house on the corner, my lad, and fetch me a copy of the Bills of Mortality. The first bill of the year had been printed this very morning, and I'm devilishly anxious to see it. You may find me in a generous mood to repay you for your speed." As he watched the boy disappear up the cobbled road, Grant considered, not for the first time, how unlikely it was that the Bills of Mortality, a dry page of statistics compiled with weekly reports of births and deaths in each of London's parishes, parishes should have become so popular with readers all over the city. Each week in the coffee house and the taverns, conversation was sure to turn to the latest news in the bills, especially if there was unusual deaths to discuss. John Grant found the bills of mortality fascinating reading at any time, but he'd heard that this week's bill there was something he would find particularly interesting. And when the errand boy returned, panting, with the page fluttering in his hands, it didn't take long for Grant to spot it. Plague by Death 1. In the mid-17th century, an occasional death from plague was not uncommon, and though it created anxiety in the immediate neighborhood, it generally didn't mean that an epidemic was about to occur. In fact, London hadn't had an epidemic of plague for nearly 20 years. And plague, as John Grant and everyone else knew, was most to be feared in the hot months of summer, not in the midst of the coldest winter that anyone could remember. But all the same, John Grant decided it would be wise to keep a close eye on the bills over the next few months. Throughout the rest of the cold, dark winter, while all London was watching the sky, John Grant was scanning the lists of deaths in the city, reading the signs that told him an epidemic of plague was coming again, looking for answers. What did John Grant know that no one else in London did? Quite a bit, actually. Grant was the owner of a popular drapers and haberdashery business. His shop sold cloth, from the coarsest cotton to the finest silks and velvets, as well as buttons, thread, and ribbons in every color of the rainbow. But running a successful business wasn't enough to keep Grant's active mind occupied. He longed to be a scientist or a scholar. During the long evenings with the shop closed and his family asleep, he found himself casting about for a subject of study, something through which he could make a name for himself. He'd always been fascinated with the bills of mortality and had saved several years' worth of the weekly statistics. In the late 1650s, Grant had started to realize just how useful the information in those dusty stacks of printed sheets could be. As a businessman, he knew the value of having information about his customers. He needed to know approximately how many births to expect each year so that he could stock the right amount of delicate linens for christening robes. And by knowing how many deaths there might be in a year, he could have enough cloth for mourning clothes on hand. At the time, there was no source for this kind of data. Grant, like other shopkeepers, was forced to depend on the intuition and experience when ordering his stock. Yet the weekly bills of mortality, which had been printed since an early plague year, 1592, contained this information. If someone was determined enough to read through each bill, Grant figured, adding up the deaths and births, he would no doubt see an average emerge and find useful patterns. With that realization, Grant had begun to wonder how many other uses there might be for the information about rates of births and deaths in the city. Comparing the number of deaths and the cases and the causes from one year to another might reveal patterns, if not only how many people were dying, but also why. He decided that he had found his subject. Success at last. Grant, collecting all the bills published over the past 60 years, and studied them closely, looking for the secrets that they held about London life. In 1662, he published a slim volume loftily titled Natural and Political Observations, mentioned in a following index and made upon the bills of mortality, with reference to the government, religion, trade, growth, air, disease, and the several changes of the said city. His book was an instant hit, and it gave John Grant the recognition he craved. In 1663, Grant was admitted to a very exclusive club of scientists, the Royal Society of London, for improving natural knowledge. Although Grant modestly described his accomplishments as just shopkeeper's mathematics, the king himself had recommended that Grant be made a member of the Royal Society. It could be that King Charles II was grateful. Grant's calculations made it clear that one of the more persistent rumors about plague, that an epidemic of the disease followed every coronation, was false. That didn't stop most people from believing it, but it helped the king to have science on his side. But Grant's biggest discovery? He had found a way to predict the arrival of a plague year. This was an earth-shaking scientific advance. For more than a century, London had been ravaged by regular epidemics of plague, one approximately every 20 years. Tens of thousands had died, and the city's population lived in fear of the next outbreak. By studying the bills of mortality, Grant had learned that the months leading up to an outbreak of plague, the death rates from all causes were significantly higher than usual. Sickly years, he called them. And in the winter of 1664, he could see from the weekly bill of mortality that London was in the midst of a very sickly year. Goodwoman Philip's death, the first one to be recorded as plague, was not going to be the last, and that he felt certain. But why exactly would death from other causes increase in the months before plague struck? Grant thought he had the answer to that too. Grant's theory is proven. John Grant's ability to predict the coming of the plague was based on his intimate knowledge of the system for collecting death statistics in London. There were no coroners, professionals who investigate the cause of death, at the time, and frequently, especially among the poor, there was no doctor in attendance at a deathbed to fill out an official death certificate. In 1603, King James I had ordered the Worshipful Company of Parish Clerks to record and report births and deaths, including their causes for each parish, the districts surrounding a church in and around London. But how could a few dozen parish clerks monitor all the births and deaths that occurred each week in the teeming streets of London? The king left that to the clerks to figure out. In the end, they did it by employing searchers like the one who had visited Goodwoman Philip's home. As John Grant saw it, there were two major weaknesses with this system. The first was that searchers rarely had any medical background, so while they were able to determine the cause of death fairly accurately in some cases, for instance, if there had been a drowning or a murder, much of the time they were only guessing. This led to some interesting causes of death appearing in the bills of mortality, including teeth, pining, evil, fools, etc., and the plain and simple found dead. The other weak point in the system was that only people willing to take on the hazardous and despised duties of searcher were poor, and they were badly paid for their services. This meant that you could bribe them easily. When the real cause of death was plague, there was considerable urgency in bribing the searcher to cover it up. Otherwise, the family of the dead person knew they were doomed to be shut up in the house, with a vastly increased risk of coming down with plague themselves. For the price of a drink and a few extra pennies, many searchers would agree to write down whatever cause of death you suggested to them. Grant estimated that up to 20% of plague deaths were mistakenly recorded under other causes of death. That meant that epidemics that periodically engulfed London actually had much longer lead times than it would appear from a casual reading of the bills of mortality. He also noted that the parish clerks, because they were officials of the Anglican Church, recorded only the births and deaths of citizens who were also church members. In 1665, this was nearly everybody, but there were significant numbers of people in London who belonged to other religious groups, Jews, Catholics, Quakers, and Nonconformists. Leaving out these groups meant that there were big gaps in the collected statistics. There were a few more scattered plague deaths in London through the rest of the cold winter and spring. As the weather turned balmy, the numbers began to increase. In the first week of June, 43 deaths from plague were recorded, as many as there had been for the whole year up till then. The next week there were 112. Soon, anyone who could afford to leave the city began packing their bags. Husbands who stayed to mind their businesses sent their wives and children to the country. The kings and all the members of his court left. Parliament was cancelled, yet John Grant stayed where he was. He had his shop to look after, but more importantly, he wanted to monitor the information that was coming in from the various parishes each week. His theory about sickly years leading to plague years was being proven before his very eyes. By mid-July, there were over 1,000 plague deaths a week in London. By September, that had increased to more than 1,000 a day. In late August, a Londoner named Samuel Pepys had written in his diary, "But now how few people I see, and those walking like people have been taken leave of the world." The city, deserted by almost all who could flee, had taken on an eerie silence. Pepys was a successful businessman, a supplier to the Royal Navy, but unlike most wealthy people, he didn't leave London during the plague. Instead, he stayed and recorded his impressions in his diary, which was published almost 2 centuries later. It is still one of the most revealing records about what life was like for people in London during the terrible year. In the fall, the plague raging across the city, Pepys noted, "Lord, how empty the streets are, and so many poor and sick people in the streets full of sores, so many sad stories overheard as I walk, everybody talking of this death, and that man sick, and so many in this place, and so many in that. And they tell me that in Westminster there is never a physician, and but one apothecary left, all being dead, but that there are great hopes of a great decrease this week. God send it." Slowly the numbers of plague deaths did begin to decrease, as fall turned to winter and weather became colder. At the end of the year, as people began cautiously returning to the city, John Grant published a booklet entitled London's Dreadful Visitation, or a collection of all the bills of mortality for that present year, which analyzed the consequences of the terrible epidemic. By December, more than 68,000 plague deaths had been recorded in a population previously estimated at 450,000. 15% of the people in London had died of plague. New knowledge but no cure. For the first time, by looking carefully at statistics, someone had partially solved the mystery surrounding plague. Hundreds of years later, scientists would remember what John Grant had accomplished. Yet even with Grant's discoveries, much about plague remained a puzzle in 1665. How did the disease start? And how did it spread? Did you catch it from breathing infected air? From contact with the victim? Or did you get it from something you ate or drank? Most terrifyingly of all, was it simply God's will that the people of London should suffer? Because medical knowledge was quite basic at the time, nearly every theory was taken seriously. There was immense variety in the proposed methods of preventing plague. Some doctors held coins in their mouths while they treated patients, believing that the metal gave them protection. Others recommended that herbs and spices combined with vinegar or tar be burned to cleanse the air of sick rooms. Many people chewed or smoked tobacco in the belief that it purified the air. Schoolboys at Eton, an exclusive private school, were punished if they forgot to smoke each morning before their prayers. Other people wore protective amulets, some containing toad poisoning. Con artists sold all kinds of exotic wonder drugs to the gullible and the desperate, including powdered unicorn horn, phoenix eggs, and the kidney stones of camels. But there were far fewer ways to treat plague than there were so-called preventatives. Although patients frequently died from loss of blood after being bled, doctors continued to use the method of treatment. Sweating was less deadly but still unpleasant. It was based on the idea that since plague caused fevers, it should be treated with heat. The sweat the sufferer produced was thought to cleanse the body of plague poisons. If all else failed, there was opium, which at least dulled the pain for the plague victims. When that too failed, there was only prayer. Meanwhile, until the Great Plague of 1665 subsided in the early 1666, wagons continued to rattle slowly up and down the nearly deserted, cobbled streets of London, collecting the dead. John Grant's grim totaling of the numbers showed that there had been only 9,967 christenings compared to the 97,360 burials in all of London that year. Could the city recover from such a blow? Grant was confident it could. London was an incredibly dangerous place to live at all times, he pointed out. There were far more deaths in the city each year than there were births, and yet the city continued to grow. People from the surrounding countryside were constantly coming to London, looking for work and a better life. And Grant predicted that within a few years the population of London would rebound. Again, he was right. Slowly, life began to return to normal in the city, as people forgot the year of terror and death. It would be nearly 230 years before anyone solved the mystery of the source of plague, and it would happen in the midst of another terrible epidemic in another part of the world entirely. In January 1894, an epidemic of bubonic plague broke out in Hong Kong, and by the following June it had caused over 80,000 deaths, mostly among poor Chinese laborers in the city. The governor of Hong Kong, Sir William Robinson, issued an international call for scientists to travel to the afflicted city in search for solutions. He was delighted when an eminent Japanese scientist, Shibasaburo Kitatsato, answered the plea for help. Scientists and doctors in Hong Kong gave Kitatsato his own laboratory full of and a full staff of assistants. In fact, there was so much excitement that Kitasato arrival that everyone overlooked another researcher who had also arrived in Hong Kong. Alexander Yersin was a Swiss bacteriologist who had been practicing medicine in the French colony of Indochina, now the countries of Vietnam and Cambodia. Unlike Kitasato, Yersin was given neither a warm welcome nor a laboratory space. He had to pay to have his own lab built, a lowly straw hut located alongside the much grander building occupied by Kitasato's office. Despite the fact that Kitasato was so much better supplied than Yersin, the two scientists quickly caught up in the race, each trying to be the first to discover the source of plague. Their competition was so fierce that Kitasato tried to prevent Yersin from getting access to the bodies of plague victims. Yersin was forced to bribe the soldiers guarding the plague wards of hospitals in order to get blood and tissue samples he needed. That June, each man announced that he had successfully isolated the bacteria that causes plague. Kitasato was initially credited with the discovery, but eventually the scientific community decided that Yersin had been the first, and the bacteria was named Yersinia pestis in his honor. Yersin also developed the first plague vaccine, which was used with limited success during an outbreak of plague in Bombay, now Mumbai, India, in 1896. In addition, he was the first to suspect that rats played a role in the transmission of bubonic plague. Although that discovery was eventually made by a French researcher, Paul-Louis Simond, in 1897. Simond's research showed that fleas called Xenophila spili. Simmons' research showed that fleas called Xenopsila chiopis were the agents transferring the infection from rat to rat when the rats died. The fleas passed the disease to humans. It took nearly 40 years for Simmons' research to be accepted by the scientific and medical community, but the mystery of plague was finally solved. Plague in modern times. Today, plague can be successfully treated with antibiotics if patients get medical attention in time, but the disease is still a feared killer. In 1993, South and Central India were rattled by a severe earthquake that damaged a number of cities, including Bangalore, Bombay, Hyderabad, and Madras, as well as many smaller villages and towns. In the earthquake's aftermath, huge shanty towns and slums sprang up to house people who had been left homeless by the disaster. The shanty towns also sheltered large numbers of rats. In September 1994, plague broke out in one of the largest slums in the city of Surat. 55 people died, an insignificant number compared to the terrible death tolls of the medieval plague epidemics, but enough to cause panic around the world. Commercial air traffic to and from India stopped. The stock market in India crashed, trade halted, and the media went crazy speculating about the possibility that plague could spread to other countries, triggering a massive pandemic, a global epidemic. Luckily, it didn't happen. Since the Indian epidemic, there have been outbreaks of plague in Algeria and other parts of Africa. Each time, international medical teams from the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control have been able to contain the outbreaks, but the WHO lists plague as a re-emerging disease, a possible threat that requires constant monitoring and vigilance. That's the end of our story. If this interests you, I would highly recommend that you do more research. At this time, please check your 4-box chart that it is complete, and then talk to your teacher about what to do next.